When looking back at the aircraft of World War II, many of the American warbirds with the stars and bars top the list, leading the way against the Axis powers with great success stories and long lists of victories over the enemy. But sometimes we forget the whole story. What about the failures, the shortcomings, and the aircraft that simply got high numbers of American pilots and crew killed? Today, this is exactly what we will look at. Let's take a look at the 5 most deadly aircraft to fly for the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, and why each death trap deserves a spot on this list. To start this list for today, let's clarify what exactly the parameters are that make an aircraft deadly to fly. For this comparison, we will be looking at exclusively one statistic: combat loss rate. Essentially, this is the percentage that any aircraft will be lost on a combat mission due to any cause. Now, for this, we will also take into account some other factors, but the overarching basis for our rankings, with exterior factors combined and skews considered, will be percent loss per sortie, or the chances that any aircraft will be lost on a given combat mission. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Coming in at number 5 is a somewhat surprising addition to the list considering its late war design and production, and this would be the SB-2C Helldiver. Many think of the Helldiver as one of the most successful late war aircraft, like the Hellcat that brought a firm defeat to the Japanese. But that isn't necessarily the case. When the Helldiver entered service, it did fulfill its role as a more advanced dive bomber to replace the SBD Dauntless, but it took a great deal of modifications, adjustments, and upgrades to the SB-2C before it entered service, which is why the TBF Avenger entered service long before the Helldiver, despite being developed a full 2 years later. Furthermore, when she did enter combat, almost everyone disliked her, pilots, commanders, and all. Hence the nickname "Son of a Second Class." Many complained about difficult handling characteristics and that she was underpowered. But many of these complaints likely stem from the fact that she had nearly impossible shoes to fill, with the smooth and easy-to-fly SBD coming before her. But to really drive this listing home, let's take a look at the per-mission loss rate. According to my sources, the Navy and Marine total loss percentages on an average mission from all aircraft of the war was 1.54%. Meaning that on a usual combat sortie, about 1.5% of aircraft would not come back. And how did the Helldiver compare? Well, the SB-2C tallied in at a loss rate of 2.58%, nearly double the Navy and Marine average. And for perspective, its predecessor, the SBD Dauntless, flew more than double the combat sorties during the war against a more powerful enemy, but only had a loss rate of 0.65%, making her one of the safest aircraft to fly in the entire conflict. This poor data for the Helldiver no doubt confirms what many of the pilots believe: that she handled poorly, was underpowered, and had unreliable electrical systems thanks to poor quality control on the part of the Curtiss Company. This left more pilots not making it back to base after sustaining damage, most often in the form of anti-aircraft fire from ground or naval targets, while the SBD would just about always keep on flying. Because of this, the SB-2C ranks in at number 5 on our list, a well-deserved spot for a bomber that simply never lived up to her predecessor. At number 4, we find an aircraft that is likely going to ruffle some feathers, as she was no doubt an effective and famed fighter. But let me explain why the P-38 Lightning has made this list. During the war, the U.S. Army Air Force loss rate was substantially lower than that of the U.S. Navy and Marines. But this is obviously due to the fact that there are far fewer emergency runways for landings in the Pacific Ocean, and carrier landings, by nature, simply result in many more aircraft being lost than a nice long grass runway. So the Army loss rate for the war was about 0.91% for all fighter aircraft. For reference, let's review some of the aircraft with notable track records. The P-40 Warhawk, on 67,000 combat sorties, tallied a loss rate of only 0.82%. The P-47 Thunderbolt, 423,000 combat sorties, the most of any aircraft, with a loss rate of 0.73%. And even the vulnerable, liquid-cooled P-51 Mustang, with 210,000 combat sorties flown, tallied in a loss rate of 1.18%. However, the P-38 Lightning, with 129,000 sorties flown, somehow brought together a loss rate of 1.35%, the highest among any Army aircraft fighter during the war, by a substantial margin. But why is this the case? To be honest, when compiling this list, I very much knew that I had to include one of the twin-engine aircraft utilized by the Army Air Force. But I expected this to be the B-26 Marauder. After all, an aircraft named the Flying Coffin or the Widowmaker surely deserved a spot on this list. But think again. Astonishingly, the Martin Marauder had the lowest per-mission loss rate of any Allied bomber during the entire war, at 0.5%, making the Flying Coffin, shockingly, one of the safest aircraft to fly. Instead, the more deadly twin-engine aircraft to her pilots would be the Lightning. This high loss rate could be attributed to a few different factors. Perhaps this could be due to the compressibility problems and tail shaking that the Lightning battled early on in her career. Or perhaps this could be due to the fact that such a large target on a fighter in a dogfight results in more losses, similar to that seen by the ME-110. Or perhaps the unique tail of the P-38 simply made it more susceptible to damage. But regardless of the reason, the interesting fact of the P-38 is that she was undoubtedly a great fighter, and many of her pilots loved her, despite the fact that she may have been a little more dangerous than many of the alternatives. But nonetheless, the data doesn't lie, and the P-38 was certainly the most dangerous Army fighter to fly during the war. Coming in at number 3 is a difficult comparison, considering the number of men that died in the U.S. Army Air Force upon heavy bombers at well over 15,000. It seems appropriate that one heavy simply has to make this list. But to be honest, this comparison was not that easy. At first, one would think that based on the B-24's reputation in contrast to that of the B-17, the choice would be simple. But upon further digging, I found that the statistics were quite surprising. In the 8th Air Force, for example, the B-17 loss rate was 1.66% per sortie, and the B-24 Liberator, an impressive 1.26%. That's right, from my research, the B-24 actually had a lower per-mission loss rate than that of the mighty B-17. This is made even more impressive by the fact that the Liberator often participated in roles that made it more susceptible to losses, typically flying in lower positions than the B-17 on tactical raids, making it an easier target for flak. But nonetheless, when I discovered this, I knew that I couldn't put the Liberator here, and I felt as if I certainly couldn't put the Fortress on the list either. But fortunately, there was one other heavy bomber that likely does deserve a spot on the American Death Traps list, and that would be the B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was yet another case of rushed production and technology that was likely too far ahead of its time. The Superfortress faced many issues in its design And testing showed just how many problems advanced technology could create. One of the most common experienced by the men in the Pacific when she was finally put into service was the infamous engine fires. Her custom-designed engines were prone to catching fire, and after that, the entire aircraft would often take flame and go down in just a few minutes. And this is directly reflected in her loss rate in the war. The final percentage after her 33,000 sorties flown was 1.38%, losing 450 aircraft during these missions. And the biggest problem with that number is that of her losses, only 147 would be due to Japanese fighters and flak. That means that the vast majority of aircraft lost were indeed due to engine fires or mechanical issues. Also noteworthy is that this number of 1.38%, while located right in the middle of the B-24 and B-17, seems quite reasonable at first. But in reality, we must think about the environment that the B-29 served in. The Japanese, by late 1944 and 45, were a weakened force. When the Superfortress entered service, Imperial Japan had very little aircraft capable of reaching her height, and even fewer properly trained pilots to intercept with any level of skill. Furthermore, the Japanese had very little flak that was capable of reaching the levels of the B-29. This was quite a contrast when compared to the missions over Germany in 43, 44, and 45, where defenses were lethal and the flak crews and weapons were likely the best in the world. This means that despite having a much weaker adversary who was lower on supplies, the B-29 still racked up a staggering loss rate, no doubt due to the many mechanical problems and failures experienced by her crews. Because of this, she easily earns a spot on our list of the most deadly American aircraft to fly. Now, before we get to the final two, I do have to take a moment and actually mention an important honorable mention here. Coming in at one of the highest loss rates per sortie of the entire war is two different U.S. Navy aircraft, the famous flying boats. This is the PBY Catalina and the PBM Mariner. According to U.S. Navy and Marine loss records, these two aircraft tallied quite an ugly loss percentage. The PBM Mariner, who flew just 506 combat sorties, saw a loss rate of 3.36%, while the famed Catalina, who flew 1,380 sorties, saw a loss rate of 4.06%, more than double the average loss rate for the U.S. Navy during the war. These abysmal numbers, however, can likely be attributed to a few different factors. First, the Catalina, for example, saw high losses early in the war when it was attempted to be used as a bomber. Furthermore, both models of these aircraft flew almost exclusively in the patrol role later in the war, flying solo, leaving them more open to attack by enemy aircraft and making them much more susceptible to losses. But despite these negative results, these aircraft no doubt served a crucial role in the Pacific War, rescuing hundreds of downed airmen from the ocean. But they certainly paid a price, seeing some of the highest loss rates of the war. But since these were not technically attack aircraft, and some of the statistics may be skewed based on their mission type, I decided that they shouldn't be placed on this list, but certainly mentioned. And that brings us to the final two contenders for the most deadly American aircraft to fly during the war. The runner-up for this list goes to an aircraft that did carry a heavy weight during the war, and was, in all honesty, thrown into a conflict for which she was truly outmatched. This would be the F-4F Wildcat. The F-4F, in 2,628 combat sorties flown, saw a staggering loss rate of 9.55%. This means that on an average mission flown by the F-4F during the war, roughly 10% would not come back. This was because the aircraft was, in most aspects, totally outclassed by its primary adversary, the Japanese Zero. And in addition, at the time that it saw the greatest use in the US Navy, American intelligence had very little information on how best to fight against the Zero. Thus, high losses were an inevitability. As the war continued, the FM-2 Wildcat, a new version, was introduced with a more powerful engine and additional improvements to the airframe. This brought losses down by a massive number, well under 2%. But for the men who were thrown into the fire in the first few months of the war, the F-4F Wildcat was no doubt considered one of the worst aircraft to fly into battle. Finally, we look at what was, without a doubt, the worst American aircraft to fly into combat, perhaps in history. This would be the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber. There is almost no good place to start here, as nearly everything about the TBD was a disaster. Strategy, design, weaponry, and bad luck all plagued the Devastator and left it with, by far, the worst loss rate of the war. Since it was quickly replaced by the Avenger, the TBD only flew 182 combat sorties during World War II. But during these handful of missions, the TBD saw a staggering loss rate of 24.18%. For perspective, with a loss rate like this, and given a force of 100 total aircraft flying combat missions, this unit would be brought down to just 6 operational aircraft in just 10 sorties. But what makes the TBD even more of a death trap than the F-4F is that by nature, torpedo bombers had to fly at extremely low altitude, making successful bailouts very unlikely. Furthermore, with a crew of 3, every operational loss potentially saw 3 crew members killed, wounded, or missing, rather than just one pilot. When the war started, by most standards, the TBD already was outdated. But nonetheless, she would actually see moments of success in early 1942. But once the Battle of Midway solidified her name in infamy, her story came to an end, leaving most of her legacy on the floor of the Pacific Ocean and earning her an easy spot at number 1 on our list. Many of the aircraft on this list did go on to make massive contributions to the war effort. However, one of the most important aspects of a successful combat aircraft is how reliably she can get her crew home safely. And unfortunately, the warbirds on this list likely fell short of that goal. Comment below, do you agree with these rankings? Or did I leave an aircraft off? Let me know what you think based on these numbers, and if you love this video, consider supporting me on Patreon so I can make more just like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.